Welcome to the video entitled Mathematics Concept Inventories, MCIs and Conceptual Capabilities for ITE Students. The proposed collaboration for this research project is with myself, Naylor, Sundas Rubab, who's a prospective PhD student, and Professor Yougan Wang. This is also using some data and with collaborators at the University of Johannesburg, South Africa, in particular the physics department and the applied mathematics department. Here's the abstract and aim. In this presentation, we're going to focus on research question 2, but just bear in mind research question 1, which is something we're hoping to do, which is to look at a systematic review of the uses of mathematics concept inventories in general. Finally, the future work, which is yet to occur, is by way of assessing ITE students in a more efficient manner. We hope that this leads to less stress and extra time to perform surveys on self-efficacy, for example. And we'll explain how we might be able to speed up the time taken to do a particular pre-test. So why ITE conceptual capability? Why do we want mathematics ITE students to be conceptually capable? Well, the big ideas are really important, and it's intertwined with the STEM subjects, and it's kind of a mixed bag, particularly for primary ITE students, where mathematics or the sciences may not be their forte. And particularly, as I mentioned, in mathematics, it's an issue. Concept inventories, CIs for short, with a pre-test and post-test, can be used to study conceptual gain. And that's the basic tool we will use, or we hope to use. For example, the force concept inventory has been used a great deal for the last 30 years in terms of physics and Newtonian mechanics. A slightly less well-known concept inventory is the calculus concept inventory, which has had some research done on it. How can we tell if, for example, the idea or the concept of gain, whatever that might be, is actually improving? Well, we want some kind of intervention, such as, for example, a self-efficacy survey or some other type of intervention, and then we try to see if that improves the gain. What are concept inventories? Well, they're a type of psychometric test that records conceptual understanding. Here is the classic formula for what's known as the HARC gain. I'll explain that in a minute. Prime examples of concept inventories in maths and science would be the FCI and the CCI, the force concept inventory and the calculus concept inventory. You would sit the pre-test at the start of the course, which is then compared to the post-test at the end of the course to find the gain G. This is due to the formula by HARC, where literally we look at the average score of a cohort for their final score relative to the initial score and normalized by 100 minus the initial score. Most of these tests are of the order of 30 questions, and you're given a set time of 30 minutes. However, students and lecturers in charge really don't have the time to do this, or it would be better if there was a more efficient way of deploying these tests. Just for your information, the Phys-Port website is an awesome website where you may find things such as the force concept inventory, the calculus concept inventory, and follow those links for translations in other languages and the level or rating of research that has been done into that particular concept inventory. What are some of the challenges of concept inventories in general? Well, in the old days, for sure, it was a paper-based test. And in fact, usually you were asked to refrain from putting the test onto a learning management system. For example, in our case, with this study that we recently did at the University of Johannesburg, we decided to start the pre-test in March 2020, just as COVID kicked in. So we had to switch from paper for pre-test into LMS Moodle for the post-test. One of the issues, I think that's one of the biggest issues, is that you need pre and post-test, and that takes time. For example, a 12-week course before you can actually see the gains. So you know, this is a paper from HARC which looked at something like 6,000 different cohorts and universities across America with different types of traditional versus interactive engagement. And just to note that during the COVID pandemic, we found a standard gain. We thought we may have had a worse score, but we didn't. The time taken is 30 minutes, plus if you want to do anything else, which is very topical in physics education at the moment, some kind of self-efficacy or self-determination theory type survey and possibly some intervention. One solution to the time issue is just to focus on the pre-test stage initially, such that you can update your teaching. So here is a snapshot of all 30 questions, and this is for two cohorts, the engineering-based cohort and a physics-based cohort. On the y-axis, positive y-axis, these are the percentages of correct scores. But what's unusual or what's different with dominant misconceptions is we decide to look at the largest percentage incorrect score, and then we set a threshold where we say, well, any score where the percentage is greater than a 50% score normalized is what we call a dominant misconception. So, for example, question 17 may focus on circular motion, and therefore we know that we need to update our teaching during the course to try and get them to a better post stage, which we can also have a similar snapshot of, and I haven't provided. Another solution is computerized adaptive testing, CAT. NatPlan has some information on this and does use some kind of CAT method. MathSpace, which as a maths and physics teacher in high school in the past I have used, claims to use some kind of adaptive testing. If it's something like item response theory, which I'll explain shortly, that would be great. I'm not quite sure. And in terms of the force concept inventory, as far as I'm aware, the work by Yasuda et al. Is the first to really try and implement this in physics. And we also would like to do the same thing in mathematics. So how do we speed it up? Well, if we use something known as item response theory, and I'll explain that shortly very briefly, then we can measure the difficult questions. So we know which questions are typically easy and which are typically hard. And then after a few questions, we can gauge whether or not the student is of a particular level. So for example, question 1, if they answer correctly, then we give them a more difficult question 2 in no particular order except in terms of difficulty. And likewise, if the question is answered incorrectly, then we give them an easier question. However, one of the limitations with this is that we require per cohort, or let's say per university, an initial database of about 1,000 students. In terms of item response theory, Nita and Iber have used what's known as the one-parameter logistic response, or known as the RASH model. For example, the difficulty parameter, the green line shows the probability of getting the correct answer, so the green line is an easier type of question. The red line is normed to 0, and the blue line would be a more difficult question. There are variants of this, such as the 2-parameter logistic model and the 3-parameter logistic model. These may give a possibly better fit to the data that you find. So what are some of the methodological challenges with CAT? Well, which model? Currently IRT models are used, but there are other methods, and as I said, there are different types of parameterizations. For example, the RASH model, or the one-parameter logistic model, is simpler, but not always representative of all the data. And for our IRT, as I alluded to earlier, we need sample sizes of the order of 1,000 to run the code in R or MATLAB or similar packages. For ITE students in a specialized field like mathematics and science, particularly in the primary age scene, the numbers are very small as well. And another interesting question that leads into future work is, well, is there a cohort dependence? So, for example, if we do a study of, say, 500 to 1,000 students in South Africa from a given cohort in, say, applied mathematics, would that be the same as a cohort similarly in Australia? Some other challenges besides time. Well, in general, when you try and deploy some kind of concept inventory, such as the forced concept inventory, sometimes the faculty themselves feel that they are being challenged. Personally, when I did this first test when I was teaching in Japan, I expected myself to have amazing gains because I was a great teacher, and that's not what you find. And you really have to work on your andragogy or pedagogy to make those gains better. In the case of UJ in South Africa, it's a diverse cohort where English is not even the first language. There are officially 13 different languages spoken in South Africa, and there aren't translations. There are only translations for English and Dutch, Afrikaans. So that does lead to interesting issues with English not being their first language. And as we alluded to, studies on the FCI the time taken to complete is not necessarily enough, and we see large unanswered questions towards the end of the test or student apathy. So we also, because we're using an LMS, we're able to actually measure how long it takes students to actually complete the test, and that's some other interesting data that we have. The conclusion and future outlook is as follows. So maths concept inventories are not as so well used and researched compared to, say, the forced concept inventory in physics, particularly in the ITE realm. And we want to look into if we need to write our own type of concept inventory in mathematics or use somebody else's. If we are able to implement computerized adaptive teaching, then we can certainly reduce the time taken from a 30-minute test down to maybe 10 or 15 minutes, which is great because that gives less anxiety to the student and possibly less student apathy to answering the questions. And this leads to more time for those other important student surveys in relation to, say, self-efficacy. It gives more time for interventions if that's not already built into the class. And our future work is to understand and use an appropriate mathematics concept inventory suitable for IT students, and eventually we hope with some type of computerized adaptive testing system. Thank you for listening, and the relevant sources can be found here.